focused with Ijaz here, though. With the U.S. and NATO troop withdrawal process from Afghanistan underway, the U.S. and its allies are preparing for the worst-case scenario. Even as U.S. military and political leaders tell Congress that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been significantly degraded, they add that a post-pullout situation will be significantly challenging. Some reports suggest Western intelligence agencies are evaluating and courting regional leaders outside the Afghan government who might be able to provide intelligence about terrorist threats after U.S. forces withdraw. One name that has emerged is Ahmad Masood, the 32-year-old son of Ahmad Shah Masood, the Tajik commander of erstwhile Northern Alliance, who was assassinated by AQ operatives just 2 days before AQ attacked targets in the U.S. Reports suggest Ahmad Masood has been gathering support in the north since entering politics in 2019. He has been opposed to the way the U.S. opened a channel with the Taliban, but is not opposed to talking to the Taliban per se. He is also critical of Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani and believes that Ghani should step down to make way for an interim government. In a March interview to France 24, Ahmad Masood said he wanted peace, but will fight if it came to that to protect the values Afghans believe in. Meanwhile, an AP report had claimed CIA Director William Burns made an undisclosed visit to Kabul late April to assess the situation. The U.S. lawmakers are pleading for evacuation of Afghan allies before the pullout, with some referring to avoiding a Saigon-like scenario. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Kamran, Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, and Adam Weinstein, former U.S. Marine who served in Afghanistan and is currently a research fellow at Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Let me begin with Kamran Bokhari here. Kamran, thinking of, getting people to sort of, support the U.S. Intelligence efforts after the withdrawal, and especially, people who are outside of the government, not part of the government, seems to me to be a throwback to the 80s and 90s, relying on, warlords essentially who had created their own satrapies and fiefdoms. It seems like the wheel has come full circle.
Well, Ijaz, in order to understand why this is happening, we have to look at the reality on the ground. The people or the factions that are opposed to the Taliban and have been part of either the government in Kabul or at least the political system are themselves not very confident of the state that the United States is leaving behind, its capabilities, especially when it comes to the Afghan national security forces, the police, the army, the intelligence services. And therefore, there have been calls for the creation of militias in various regions. We've heard from Herat. We're hearing similar reports from the Northwest and the North. So if this is the reality on the ground, then the United States just can't put all its eggs in one basket, which is the Afghan government, and therefore needs to have a diverse set of partners to make sure that transnational jihadism does not radiate beyond the borders of Afghanistan. So I'm not surprised that this is happening. It's not to say that the Americans are abandoning the political system in Kabul, but if you look at the agreement with the Taliban, and if you look at the meeting that took place in Doha, Qatar, last year, in which Secretary Pompeo said, we're not here to impose a government on you or a constitution. It's up for the Afghans to decide. So if that's the stance of the United States, then it needs to be able to have plan B, plan C, and plan D if things don't go well. These are all contingency scenarios.
Right. They are contingency scenarios. Frankly, Kamran, I don't think they have a plan B or C. And also, if they're going to finally, go for assets outside the government and rely on intelligence, then it seems to me that they're not particularly confident about the staying power of the current Afghan government. But let me take this to Adam Weinstein here. What is your assessment, Adam? What do you think is happening, given the ground situation?
I think some of what was just said is true in terms of there being low confidence for the ability of the ANDSF to keep fighting, or the Afghan security forces to keep fighting. But some of these dynamics have existed throughout the war. For example, what's often called the post-Bonn political order, the Afghan government that came into existence after the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. In that system, the president has a great deal of power. For example, provincial governors are appointed. And so, just in the last few days, a governor was appointed to Faryab province, and now Rashid Dostum's men are taking to the streets with RPGs and weapons and protesting that appointment. So you can see how a very a strong central government and in some cases province center relations that are strained can lead or strengthen strongmen and militias, and that's another factor at play besides perhaps lack of confidence in the central government and the ANDSF. And I think one of the issues is that some of these U.S. contingencies can become Plan A. And if you look at the dynamics that existed before the invasion, the CIA already had contacts with Ahmad Shah Masood, so those contacts already existed. And I think the United States didn't fully appreciate the tensions even between the Northern Alliance and Pakistan, for example, and at the time it, of course, needed Pakistan's help to deal with al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So when the United States begins to deal directly with strongmen, I think it delegitimizes the Afghan government, and it also brings the United States into a web of tensions and tribal dynamics and all sorts of other issues that oftentimes folks in the U.S. government don't fully grasp, and that's when mistakes happen.
Right. That's a very important point. So, Kamran, so there's a bit of irony here, which is that after the U.S. invasion, the kind of constitution that was, or the form of government that was put in place was a centralized government. Now, the Afghan history there's been a motif that runs through the Afghan history, i.e., that every time Kabul has decided to do something for which it did not negotiate with the periphery or the countryside, people rose up in revolt. Now, to begin with, the new Afghan constitution actually went against the spirit of Afghan history. Now, in this ironic twist, what we see is that the U.S. and its allies are going back to essentially a very decentralized approach to Afghanistan, where they might hope that the Kabul government will survive for a while, but thinking that it might not, they are going to have assets, as we said earlier, and which you also pointed to, given the ground situation. So we are looking at a situation of utter chaos. So it may not be as bad as Operation Frequent Wind, which is the Saigon scenario, but it's not really the kind of scenario that the U.S. would have wanted to after 20 years of war effort.
Absolutely, but I would sort of caution there, because there are many of us in Washington who have been sort of concerned about this for a very long time. People have written as far back as the inauguration of President Obama that in order to fight al-Qaeda, it is not necessary to fight the Taliban, and I think that understanding has matured to where the United States has finally realized that it doesn't need to expend these resources. So what does that mean moving forward? In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that we can't look at the Bonn process or the government that came out and the U.S. effort and the international coalition's efforts to support the new political system as sort of a be and all, is that is the only focus of the United States and its allies to stabilize the country. over the years. There has been a learning, and I think that it is a difficult terrain to operate in. There are no perfect solutions. There are no good options. So I think what's happening here is a realization that we need the Taliban in the mix. So hence the negotiations, hence the agreement. We can't just sort of expect this government or this political system to endure. And not just because the Taliban are attacking it. It's something I've written about in years past, is that even the state, the anti-Taliban camp, is deeply divided. So how do you manage such a chaotic, if you will, political landscape, which is a battle space, quite frankly speaking? So again, no good options, and you're putting together the best case scenario, especially when you're no longer going to be in country. So it makes sense to have influence over the Taliban, have influence into whatever remains of the Kabul government moving forward. It becomes decentralized. It changes, it evolves. Who knows what's going to happen? And then, of course, the regional warlords, the regional figureheads. So as long as you have enough influence all across the spectrum, then at least you have semblance of a plan to or a method to the madness that's going to follow.
Okay. Now, a quote from a New York Times report, and the report quotes Lisa Maddox, a former CIA analyst who has done extensive work on Afghanistan. And according to her, supporting any sort of insurgency or building a resistance movement poses real challenges. And the concern is, what would the second resistance involve, and what would our goals, as in the U.S. goals, be? I fear folks are suggesting a new proxy war in Afghanistan. I think that we have learned that we cannot win. Now, this is Adam Weinstein. This comes from someone who has analyzed Afghanistan over many, many years and who has actively been involved in intelligence operations in Afghanistan. And the verdict is that this kind of proxy war cannot be won by the U.S. So we agree that this is a very difficult situation, or to quote the former U.S. Secretary of State, this is a wicked problem. But it seems to me that probably, that's not the best course of action. But the only course of action that does offer some degree of stability is to follow and push the intra-Afghan talks and get to some kind of interim government. And it seems to me that the U.S., which was interested in fast-pacing the talks, has finally decided that it's not worth it. That's a secondary thing. Let the regional countries work that out. We just need a safe withdrawal.
I would say that the United States can act as a facilitator for regional negotiations, but intra-Afghan negotiations should be Afghan-led, and regional negotiations should be led by the region. But that doesn't mean that the United States shouldn't remain diplomatically involved or act as a facilitator where it can. I also agree with Dr. Bokhari that you can fight al-Qaeda without fighting the Taliban. And in fact, that realization was something that escaped U.S. leaders for years for some reason. And I don't understand it. Now, I think if you kept U.S. troops in the country for CT purposes, that would inevitably become a counterinsurgency because your partner force would be the ANDSF. And of course, they're highly motivated to fight the Taliban and al-Qaeda. But once you withdraw and you no longer have boots on the ground, I think you can have a CT-focused mission and not be fighting the Taliban. And I also agree with Dr. Bokhari that you have to be talking to everyone. I think it's important to talk to everyone. But the reporting I saw in that Times piece, it went above, it went beyond talking. What it suggested was there might be plans to basically be empowering specific warlords for CT aims. And, in that scenario, I think we'd have to prioritize CT risks with, the the future stability of the country. Now, it may be the case that the Afghan government does not survive in its current form, or it may not. But I think we have to consider the effects of our actions, and even the impact of reporting that says we're talking to specific warlords, and how that can impact the Afghan security forces, how it can impact commanders, how it can impact Afghans themselves in terms of what figures they rally around and how much legitimacy the government has.
Okay. Kamran, Bokhari, I want to get your assessment on the capacity of the NSF. Now, obviously, NSF also has specialized units. For instance, the CIA, and this is different from what the U.S. military was doing in terms of training the special forces and the NSF. But the CIA was training what was called the counterterrorism pursuit teams, the CTPTs, and these teams were used in some of the provinces like Konard and Paktia, Kandahar, even for protection in Kabul. And apparently, some of the reports suggest that a couple of these units have now been transferred to the Afghan Intelligence, the National Directorate of Security. We also know that there have been reports of human rights violations by some of these teams. So give me your assessment of the capacity. And we are still assuming that in the foreseeable future, there will be direct budgetary support for the NSF from the U.S. and its allies.
I think, Ijaz, in that last statement of yours, the last point you made, that's sort of where everything is now hinging on. At least that's what the United States and its allies around the world are depending on, which is the power of the purse. And it's not just to budgetary support to Afghan national security forces or the Afghan government, broadly speaking. Look, even if the Taliban get a piece of the action or dominate the political scene, they too need money. And I think that will give the United States a lot of leverage over the battle space, because at the end of the day, the Taliban do not want to go back to September 10, 2001, where they were sanctioned, unrecognized, and were hurting for money. But to answer your question, look, the Afghan national security forces. There are three components to it: the army, the police, and the NDS. In my work that I've done over the years, I think that probably the most effective organization, speaking from a holistic point of view, is the NDS. They have as a professional entity, and they're very effective one. Compared, again, I'm relatively comparing to the police's performance and the performance of the army. And then the army's performance also varies by geography. What area are you operating under? Because we have to measure these things based on actual performance in various theaters. So it could be that those four units of the Afghan army that were fighting in Taliban-dominated areas, well, obviously they're not going to perform that well because they're in hostile territory where the local population is against them and siding with the Taliban, compared to other areas where they may have performed well. So it's a mixed bag. But in the end, what matters for this entire edifice called the Afghan National Security Forces to prevail or to persist and to continue is there is that confidence or morale, if you will, that look, the political leadership that we respond to. So if you're an Afghan cop or an Afghan soldier or intelligence operative of the NDS, you are doing your job so long as you are confident that your political leadership, your political masters know what they're doing and they have a plan. And if you don't have that, then you can see defections. And that's where we get into trouble. And that's where the question, and the question is, how quickly does that happen or not? And then that will determine the overall effectiveness of the Afghan national security forces. And I would like to add that the militias that are being raised will turn this into an Iraq-like scenario where you have the Iraqi security forces run by the government in Baghdad, but you have this massive popular mobilization front called, which is the Grand Shiite Militia Alliance, which is controlled by Iran. So to go back to the proxy question, if you have militias run and at the same time you have the Afghan National Security Forces struggling, this is going to become a very complicated battle space. And this is where the Taliban will basically break the rules that they have, or at least the guarantees they've given to the United States, that they will not allow transnational jihadist elements to exist on Afghan soil. Those transnational jihadists will be brought into the Taliban ranks as a force multiplier.
Yes, or just because it's a complicated battle space and the Taliban do not really control the entire territory, they simply will not have the capacity to control any of these transnational jihadist networks. So, it could be either way. But before I wrap up, let me go back to Adam Weinstein. So, Adam, top CIA officials, including William Burns, have acknowledged that they're looking for new ways to collect information. That's what actually we were talking about in terms of having assets outside the government. But they're also saying that their ability to gather information on terrorist activity is diminished. Now, if the battle space becomes as sort of complicated as Kamran is just mapped for us, then there still will be spaces which will not be controlled by anyone, whether the government forces, whether the militias, whether the Taliban, and you could always have the transnational networks thrive in those spaces or actually get protection from one or the other.
Well, I think this is why it's so critical to continue a diplomatic push to try to get some sort of political settlement, even if that remains a small likelihood or that outcome remains unlikely. But I think we have a small window where it perhaps is possible. It's true that the U.S. intelligence community would have partners in Afghanistan. I mean, the NDS is very good at collecting intelligence, but yet the NDS has committed some pretty dismal human rights violations, and so have elements of the ANDSF and elements of the U.S. military. But I think we have to remember that when those things happen, it does increase support for groups like the Taliban, not so much out of admiration for the Taliban, but out of discontent with the central government. So that's a concern that we have to have. But I would just caution against prioritizing perceived CT risks or terrorism risks over the stability of the Afghan state. I do agree we have to have a realist approach to the future of Afghanistan and accept that it could become unstable and devolve into a civil war reminiscent of the 1990s. But I don't think the ANDSF is so fragile right now that will happen quickly. If we look at a lot of the dysfunction in the Afghan military, it was due to lack of leadership, even at the platoon level commander. So it wasn't necessarily just because Afghan soldiers didn't have confidence in leadership at the top. They didn't even really have good leadership at the unit level. I think the Afghan security forces have evolved a bit on that. Certainly, we see a problem with cohesion. I don't think they'll dissolve as rapidly as some folks have predicted. But yeah, there is going to be a concern that we see this sort of constellation of militias evolve, and we see regional countries becoming even more involved in the battle space, and it becomes very complex. That's why I think the United States needs to use whatever remaining diplomatic leverage it has with regional actors, including Pakistan, to try to push for a political settlement. I do think aid in the future going forward will allow for some leverage over either a future Afghan government in its current form, a power-sharing government, or a Taliban-dominated government. But so far as the Taliban, the aid only goes so far. I think the Taliban have become more sophisticated when it comes to diplomacy and traveling around and trying to refine their message and incorporating diplomatic language into their statements, but I'm not sure that the Taliban know how to govern, and they certainly don't have a significant governance experience over the last 20 years, even though they do control large areas of Afghanistan. And I'm not sure that the leadership of the Taliban fully appreciates just how much it needs aid, or even if it does realize it needs aid, I don't know that it grasps the kinds of compromises that would be necessary to ensure that international aid goes forward. So I think that leverage exists, but I think we have to be careful not to exaggerate it, which is why this window of opportunity to get some sort of settlement is so important, even if it is probably far-fetched.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. In fact, some of the points raised by Kamran, Bokhari, and Adam Weinstein lead to other questions, but unfortunately, television always have short time, but this topic is obviously not going anywhere, so we'll pick it up once again at some point. Thank you to Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Dr. Adam Weinstein. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Pakistan's multilateral diplomatic effort to highlight Israel's aggression against Palestinians in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Pakistan seems to have embarked on multilateral diplomacy to highlight Israel's latest aggression against Palestinians. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi met with his Turkish counterpart, Mevlut Cavusoglu, in Ankara yesterday and is scheduled to participate in the emergency session called by the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, Eastern Time. Qureshi said Pakistan was establishing contacts with different countries in a bid to pressure Israel to stop attacks on Gaza, which has been continuing since May 10th. UN General Assembly President Volkan Bozkır, who's a Turkish diplomat, had on Monday informed all UN members that Algeria and Niger, as chairs of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Arab Group in New York, had asked for a general debate on the situation in the Middle East and the question of Palestine. In a letter to all member states, the UNGA president said he had decided to hold the meeting on May 20th as requested to discuss the situation in occupied territories and Pakistan's role. I'm joined by Dr. Andreea Stoian-Karadeli, independent expert on national security and terrorism, and Ambassador Riffat Masood, a former diplomat who served as Pakistan's ambassador to Norway and Iran. Let me begin with Ambassador Masood here. Ambassador Masood, what exactly is happening? I mean, in the sense that, of course, Pakistan has traditionally supported Palestine. Pakistan has also traditionally condemned Israeli aggression, but this time it seems that Islamabad is kind of taking a rather proactive role in this. Has something changed?
Not much has changed. It's just Pakistan has a traditional role, as you've pointed out, of trying to bring about some kind of settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have been traditional supporters of Palestine. This time, of course, as you know, a lot of things have been happening in this region in the past few months. We have had a situation arising with Iran. We have had public diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy taking place with the UAE. We have had Prime Minister visiting and Foreign Minister visiting Saudi Arabia. And there have been tensions in this region for some time now. If you recall, there had been a cyber attack on one of Iran's nuclear facilities last month in April, and Iran had blamed Israel for it. And Israel has long been saying that Iran is supporting Hamas. Pakistan has been trying to bring about some kind of understanding between the Arab countries and Iran. And for this to take place now, for an incident like this, for escalation at this point is, of course, very, very serious. And Pakistan plays a very important role. It is in a very unique position also to play a role as a third party, as you might like to call it, because since we do have very close ties with the Arab countries, with the Middle Eastern countries, we are long-standing supporters of Palestine. We are also on good relations with Iran. So we have this position in which we can bring about some kind of understanding between these warring parties. You know, it's a very old issue. It's not going to be settled so soon. But for something as serious as this to happen, soon after UAE recognizes Israel, soon after the tensions with Iran and the Israel, which continue, and over the nuclear facility attack, soon after Saudi Arabia and Iran have entered into some kind of talks, and most importantly, when the JCPOA, the nuclear deal talks between the United States and the European Union countries and Iran have also revived. So this is a very, very crucial time for Israel to actually carry out this operation. And it seems to be sending a clear message that it is against any kind of understanding between Iran and the Middle Eastern, especially the Gulf countries, or Iran having to re-enter in any form the nuclear deal. This said, aside from this, of course, the immediate problem is to bring the hostilities to a halt. The immediate situation is to bring about the ceasefire. And for that, of course, Foreign Minister Qureshi has been playing a very proactive role. We hope that tomorrow's General Assembly session, which has been called in an emergency, will be able to bring about some kind of a ceasefire in this region.
Right. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, covert and now publicly acknowledged talks, the Abraham Accords and the rest of it is all known, and so they're important. But there's also been another thing, and if I were to apply Occam's razor to sort of simplify this, lots of analysts have also talked about the fact that this particular round that has happened with the provocation in the Aqsa Mosque, because let's not forget that's where it actually started, has a lot to do with domestic Israeli politics, with the fact that Netanyahu is under pressure, he's facing corruption charges, but he has created this crisis, and essentially to change the perception, and of course Hamas, according to some analysts, has played right into his hands by getting into this fray. So what would you say to that?
No, absolutely. You're right. I was going to come to that. That of course the internal situation in Israel is also a major contributing factor to the present violence. As you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been able to form a government, and he's also been facing. He knows that once he leaves office, he will be facing these corruption charges. So this is a perception, and it's quite possible that, of course, it happens in public, in diplomacy and in international relations, that in order to take the attention off of domestic issues, to trump up an international issue. And one thing which is also very unique about this particular crisis in Israel is that for the first time we have Arabs living in Israel also being swamped into this. So it's not only the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also the Arabs living in Jerusalem who have been roped into this, have been swamped into this conflict. And you are right, of course, that there are internal issues. But you see, the timing is very, very important. It is a time when some kind of efforts, although very, very, very initial, very nascent, some efforts are being taken to bring about some kind of stability in this region. And these efforts we have seen over the past week. But, to bring about, to start a conflict at this particular time thwarts not only those efforts, but also puts a damper on any kind of future negotiations that could take place.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Riffat Masood speaking with us. Dr. Andreea Karadeli, I want to draw your attention to something slightly different, of course, related to what's happening there. And that has to do with the way the narrative is built, the way international media report this, the way, the language is used in terms of creating false equivalences in terms of looking at it as a conflict between two probably symmetric forces, which is not the case at all. Give me your view of, since you work in the area of peace and conflict, give me your sense of how the use of language, not just the narrative built by the Israelis, but also by the international media, supposedly objective international media, works to the disadvantage of the Palestinians.
Please allow me to express my condolences to the people that have died in the past days in those conflicts, in those clashes. I must say that you just brought the ball to my place, basically, because in the past few days, it's been a lot of frustration that has gathered in terms of the way media has presented this whole conflict. And as a person who speaks various languages, I have been listening to media's perspective in various countries, even to my home country, which is Romania, and in some way represents a part of Europe's perspective to the issue. And I must underline the fact that the word that I can use for this, from expressing my own feeling regarding the way media has perceived and kind of reflected the whole conflict, is frustration. All we have done in the past in terms of Europe and US, we have helped presenting an aggressor and turning an aggressor into a victim. And that's not fair. Maybe we shouldn't even talk about victims and aggressors. We just have to focus on joint forces in solving all the conflicts, so that we won't have children dying because of game playing, game playing in the back garden. That's actually the issue. We have been seeing Israel posing in a victim, and showing how their houses have been destroyed, how their people have been killed, when on the other side we have children dying each hour. On the other side, we also have one more issue that should be brought up. The fact that people have been, people, and especially the international side, when it comes to forces from the Islamic part, from the Muslim world, more countries have joined forces. And here we have the role of Turkey, who is no longer the Turkey that was in 1997, when, again, we actually had back then military coming from Turkey into Palestine at the request of Palestinian authorities. But what's happening now is the fact that we have a stronger Turkey, we have a stronger Pakistan, we have a stronger Muslim world, although we cannot see we couldn't really hear any Arab voices, to be honest. I was actually interested in hearing more Arab voices speaking confidently on this issue and being confidently on the side of Palestine. But unfortunately, I couldn't really hear that. I couldn't really see that. But Turkey has been very vocal. Pakistan has been very vocal. They've been joining forces. They are going together to the United Nations General Assembly, and that's very important because we see more countries, staying shoulder to shoulder to Palestine to help the people that are now under siege. That's the word, and there's no reason.
Right. I'm going to return to you on the issue of language because I think, I find it extremely important in the sense that that's how narratives are built. We have, frankly, Pakistan has seen this, and Pakistan has suffered this in relation to how India has developed its narrative in terms of Indian occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. But stay with me. Joining me now is Khalil Asali, journalist, writer, and publisher of Akhbar al-Balad from Jerusalem. Mr. Asali, thank you so much for being with us. I greatly appreciate you taking out the time to speak to us about this. So for our viewers, because things become complicated, for our viewers, could you perhaps refer to the original provocation that began this crisis, so that one can sift the grain from the chaff?
Yeah, actually, the provocation starts for a long time, and it always start from the Aqsa Mosque, and then it reflects in all over Palestine and over even inside Israel. So what happened is that the Israeli they are not taking care of what the Muslims feel about the Aqsa Mosque. They try hardly as much as they can to change the status quo at the Aqsa Mosque. And they still, after more than 70 years of occupation, all Palestine and Jerusalem, they still didn't understand the sensitive of this subject. And they keep telling us and everybody that Jerusalem is totally different story than the West Bank and then the Arabs inside Israel. But what happened recently is the opposite. It's they learn hardly that Jerusalem and the Aqsa is the cornerstone of what's going on. So what happened right now between Israel and Gaza and the attack from Israel on Gaza and destruction Gaza, it's actually just another evidence that still Israel didn't understand the situation, and they still believe that they can do whatever they want because they have the power.
Mr. Asali, two questions. One, give us a sense of how much of this, of course, I mean, the Israelis have claimed Jerusalem for a very long time, but how much of this, in terms of the situation deteriorating, has to do with former U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to, move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem? That's one question. And secondly, how much of this recent crisis has to do with Netanyahu's own sort of political binds and the corruption cases?
Actually, the answer of the two questions is the same answer, because first of all, what the Americans done, and they keep doing that until now, even under President Biden, it's still the same thing. Nothing changed on the ground. The Americans are continue to support Israel, full support, despite all the victims and all the pictures that are coming from Gaza. And on Jerusalem issue, for example, until now, Biden promised the Palestinian official that he might reopen the General Council that is dealing with the Palestinian issue in Jerusalem. Until now, he didn't do that. So it means that his policy will continue, but less harsh than the President Biden. On the issue of Netanyahu, it's obvious that this crisis and this war against Gaza and what happened in Jerusalem and right now is in the West Bank is really serving his purposes, is really saving his life as a politician life in his government. Right now, nobody talks about other government except Netanyahu government or going to the election. So he used the tension, and he used the Aqsa, and he used the suffering of the people in Gaza for his local purpose. And I still remember what Henry Kissinger says once, that there is nothing called Israeli foreign policy, it's just interior policy, and that's what happened. What Netanyahu is doing and what Netanyahu is doing outside in the Palestinian and around the world is exactly, he's like talking to his voters and his party. And just before an hour, he has a very large meeting with all the diplomats, foreign diplomats in Israel, and what he says, it's like he's not talking to the diplomats, he's talking to his street.
Right. Very quickly, Mr. Asali, there's also been now, and this is kind of new, perhaps, tension between the Israeli Arabs and the Israelis because of this situation. How much is that different from the past crises, and how significant is that?
Actually, it's very significant, and it's very important because, first of all, we don't call them Israeli Arabs. We call them the Arabs inside Israel because there is nothing called Israeli Arabs. Second, what happened in the last 10 days inside the Arab country, the Arab cities and the towns inside Israel is just telling you the story that the Israelis did until now. They didn't accept the Arab as their citizen. They still dealing with the Arabs as a third or fourth decision, and this is why they keep trying right now. Right now, there is a huge campaign inside Israel to rebuild the relationship between the Arabs and Israelis, and that it will take a long time because the picture that coming there, the clashes that coming from there, is just show that the police and the settlers is in one hand and the Arabs in the other hand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Khalil Asali speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Dr. Andreea Karadeli. Dr. Karadeli, you heard what Khalil Asali was saying. I mean, so the situation is obviously pretty complex. Now, going back to presenting the narrative. Now, of course, Palestine over the years, fortunately, has been able to build a credible resistance narrative. But still, a lot of work needs to be done. In that, and let me go back to what you said earlier about no real condemnation coming from the Arab countries. Now, that is something where I believe the Muslim majority countries need to create a consensus, even those that have recognized Israel, in order to be able to put pressure on Israel, because that's the only way to go about this. How far do you think is that likely possible?
To be honest, I think it is hard, but not impossible to do. In the past weeks, we've had some very, I would say, optimistic steps taken. For instance, we have the reapproachment between Turkey and Egypt. That's again an instance that might benefit in a way or another the Palestinian-Israeli conflict when it comes to the support that Egypt might give in this regard. Then if Egypt provides any support, that's going to be UAE and Saudi Arabia might turn in as well. But again, that becomes a bit more and more complex because then comes in the Iran issue and Iran-Saudi Arabia relations, Iran-UAE relations. So I think it's not there are levels and levels of relations and issues, diplomatic issues that we have at sight when it comes to Palestine and Israel. It's not just the scene with two actors. It's the scene with two main actors and then several even more important actors that are playing behind and appearing on the scene from one time to another. But what is interesting and what is to be emphasized is the fact that we cannot have a result if we not have the Muslim world united. It is not, Turkey is strong, Pakistan is strong. I could see reaction from some other countries, some other Muslim countries, but we need the Muslim world united on the side of Palestine. Because we have to counteract in a way or another all this narrative all this, I would say, pro-Israeli narrative. That's how it is. That's how we have to say it. We have to say things as they are. There have been mistakes done on both sides. No one is purely without mistake in here. But what we're seeing now is Palestine at siege, is the Palestinian children that are killed, Palestinian women that are killed, and as far as I remember, the international law. So we should start from now on to say things as they are and to put things as they are in front of the people, in front of the global, media as well. So, but in the same way, we cannot do that, and nothing is going to be sufficient enough if we don't have the Muslim countries, the Arab countries in the game, properly in the game as well.
Absolutely. I mean, in any case, this lack of consensus even goes against the Arab League's own resolutions with reference to Israel and the Palestine issue. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Andreea Stoian-Karadeli speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at Indus.news. Meanwhile, latest data now show increased COVID-19 positivity post-Eid. So please stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.